Right, hello everybody. Welcome to our final Masterclass series. This one is on data. So for those of you who've been joining us throughout the months where we've covered topics, everything from outreach all the way through to progression, this is our last one, so it's on data. This one is a slightly different format in the fact that rather than having a round table for a discussion, what we've now got is actually a number of different case studies, which we'll go through today. And then I'm pleased to say we've got Nick Miller, who will be joining us a little bit later to talk to us a little bit how to manipulate and crunch and get the most out of your data. So just while a few more people are joining us, I'll just then take you through our agenda today. Lindsay, if you could move on to the next slide, that'd be great. So initially, Lindsay from the Social Mobility Commission, so one of my colleagues, will be talking to you about our own data guidance, which we launched last Tuesday. So she'll be going through that in detail, and the slides will be shared with you after the event, although most of you should have already received that. So again, you can take time to read the content. But we'll be going through the data guidance and a scorecard, which we've also published. And in that, we'll talk a little bit about how you can get the most out of your data and get people to obviously respond when you're sending out those surveys. Then, as I mentioned, we've got 4 case studies, and each of these organisations very kindly come to speak to you today about they're in different parts of the journey. So some will have been collecting data for a number of years and be using those really to inform their social mobility interventions. Others are at the start of the journey. So it's to give you an idea of how you yourselves can get started, because I imagine, again, a lot of you on the call will be at different stages. And then, as I mentioned, we will have the bridge group. Our hope is that throughout of all of this session, we'll have 3 Q&A sessions, one after Lindsay, one after the case studies, and then we're hoping we'll have time again at the end. But it very much depends, obviously, on the run of these things, as is always the case with webinars. So before I keep whittering on, I shall now hand over to my colleague, Lindsay, and let her take the stage. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Nina, and welcome everybody. We're going to start with just some basic housekeeping. Hopefully we all know all of this. Please remain on mute. I think we've set it so you don't have that option, but just in case, we are recording today and plan to distribute, so keep that in mind. And finally, as Nina says, please use the chat function. We will be answering your questions throughout. We would really welcome hearing from you and answering your questions today. So starting with, excuse me, what is social mobility? So those of you who have attended our other workshops, hopefully by now will be really knowledgeable about this definition. It is, for those new to the agenda, the technical definition is the link between your person's occupation and income and the occupational income of their parents. So essentially, it's about ensuring your background doesn't determine your future. So before we got going today, we asked you some questions to see where you're at in the space. We wanted to know who we're talking about. So we're reflecting this back to those of you who responded to that poll. So what we found is that actually, really encouragingly, a lot of you are already collecting social mobility data, about 80% of you. And 73% of you have that on your HR system, which is brilliant, best practice, very well done. Now, where we get a little bit less stellar on our results is that very few of you are publicly sharing that data, only about 20%, and actually even less of you are sharing it, or sorry, only a little bit more than you are sharing it within the business. So even though 80% of you are collecting it, only 53% are actually sharing it internally, which is a really interesting tidbit, I thought. We also then find, or you responded, that only about 20% of you are using it to help inform the success of your hiring, your outreach and your hiring strategy. So we hope that throughout the course of today and throughout your experience with the Social Mobility Commission's microsite, you will be able to learn how to apply that data to your strategy and really use it to drive change. So let's first off and start with what are we here to talk about? Many of you will know that the Social Mobility Commission last week released a new data kit. We changed what we recommend employers to do. So when we launched our current employers toolkit in February 2020, we began working really closely with employers to help them bed in practice. What we found in the feedback that folks like yourself, maybe some of you on this call gave us, is that it's really tough to collect this type of data. And in fact, for many of you, data was a specific barrier to being able to progress the agenda, or indeed even enter into the agenda for some people. We also found through our partnership with the Social Mobility Foundation, that's what SMF is, in their index, employers index last year, just 17% of employers entering the index asked the best question, the kind of most accurate, the best measure of socioeconomic background. This was really staggering to us, that even though we had guidance out saying this is the one to ask, very few of what we would consider kind of best practice, top of the pack, SMF index employers were asking it. In addition, we knew that that question in part is because it was too long. We also know many of you struggle to understand how to drive up response rates and then what we do with the data after it. So what did we do? We spent months consulting with academic experts, think tank charities, employer groups, individual employers, and we created one key measure, one key question to measure socioeconomic diversity most accurately and simply. So what we have now is, instead of going through a 4-part question, long, rigorous, multiple survey responses, you've got one key question that you can put with no follow-ups, simple coding. That key question is, what was the occupation of your main household earner when you were aged about 14? This is the best measure for a range of reasons. Academic experts know that this most accurately predicts somebody's socioeconomic background. It is also simple. People are able to respond to it well. It gets pretty high response rates. It's internationally applicable. So if you have a workforce with quite a range of folks from international backgrounds, some of the other questions are quite UK specific. This, it doesn't matter. It also then allows you to group your workforce into more kind of nuanced buckets. So what we did, we won't go into the details now today, but we managed to simplify it. It previously was a 4-part question. We brought it down to 1, and this is the exact wording that you should use. It's up on the microsite, socialmobilityworks.org, and you should absolutely keep it like this. But what we're showing here on the screen is, after you ask the question, you group it into 3. This is how you group respondents. So if somebody selects modern professional and traditional professional occupations, you would code that in your systems as professional background. If someone selects technical and craft occupations as their parent's occupational group, you code them as from an intermediate background. So again, it's a one-stop shop, highly simple, use the exact wording we have here. But the thing to keep in mind is, if you are one of those employers who is actually already using the 4-part question, don't worry, keep it, absolutely keep it. This simplified version is perfect for those new to the agenda, and also is great for supplementary surveys. So if you do kind of quick, short pulse surveys of your workforce, if you have kind of shorter supplementary surveys where that 4-part question is just a bit too in depth, either from an analytical perspective or just a survey length perspective, use this one. But again, if you have the original 4-part version, go ahead and keep it. You will have slightly better accuracy with the 4-part version than with the simplified version, but that's okay too. Either way will work for you. So I really hope, if you take nothing else away from today's session, what I want you to take away is that this is the question, whether you use the simplified version or the original 4-part version. This is the key question you should be asking to measure socioeconomic diversity and inclusion. If you are not asking this question, or if it's not your primary question that you use, we really encourage you to take a look at your systems and update them with this new simplified version. So Next, though, once you've already conquered that, once you've got that question that measures socioeconomic background, and you want to be among the best, we then recommend an additional 2 questions. We say you should be asking, what type of school did you attend for the most time between the ages of 11 and 16? This is specifically a measure of extreme privilege, because what you want to look for in this measure is how many people went to independent schools or fee-paying schools. Again, this is a very UK specific question, so if you have a large international population in your workforce, it's not going to be quite ideal. It's also, I should say again, not an explicit measure of socioeconomic background, because it's only looking at extreme privilege. So do make sure you always look at this comparatively to that key question. Similarly, question 3, we suggest you also ask in cohort with question 2, whether somebody received free school meals when they were in school. This is a measure of extreme disadvantage, so it's the complement to the independent school question. Again, it's not an explicit measure of socioeconomic background. You cannot stratify either of these answers, so do make sure you use both of them alongside the key question. The other thing I'd say is, again, if you have already been asking question 2, please do make sure to take a look at our microsite, because we have updated one of the categories. Finally, we used to suggest to employers that you also ask about your person's parents' qualification. So we used to ask, what qualification did the main earner in your family receive? We have really revamped this. That measure is generally not a good measure of socioeconomic background. It's also a measure that many employers used primarily, which was a really big problem, because people were using that but not then, and then assuming that the answers showed socioeconomic background, which is not the case from an accuracy perspective. The other problem with the parental qualification measure was that you can't benchmark it to the population, because participation in higher education has changed over the decades. So instead, we again worked with our panel of experts and charity groups like Sutton Trust, Social Mobility Foundation, The Pledge, to revamp this question so that it is optional and only if you have graduate schemes. So if that applies to you, make sure again, go to the microsite for the updated wording. And what we suggest instead is that you ask, did either of your parents attend university and receive a degree by the time you were 18? So this now is a measure of whether you were first in family to attend university, and it helps you understand the unique context that somebody who doesn't have a parent who went to university may have experienced. There's lots of academic literature that shows that for people who are first in family tend to struggle more at school. They're not able to navigate university pipelines. They may not know to come to look for your business. They may not know what opportunities await them after school. So it's still a really useful measurement, but again, only use it if you have graduate works at graduate schemes, and always use it alongside these other measures. So it should be an addition, not a solo question. So Nick, when he comes on from the Bridge Group, is going to talk a bit more about this. Mainly, I know response rates are critical. You need to have good quality data to be able to analyze it. We have a range of recommendations on our microsite and here, which you can go through at your leisure after this session. And again, Nick is going to talk a little bit more about this, but make sure that you follow this guidance. Do not just simply add these questions to a survey without doing any other work around it. It's not going to work. It's going to backfire. The other thing that we suggest is start small. Set really achievable targets. We have a case study on our microsite, for example, of HMRC, who when they first put their socioeconomic background question on their surveys, their goal was 30% response rate. They've been able to then drive that up all the way to our recommended target of 60% for new employers to the agenda, and over 75% for those mature in their socioeconomic strategy. Do make sure though that again, whatever you do, make sure you have clear messages about why this is important, why you are doing it, and how data storage and confidentiality will be protected. Those are the key things. So you've asked all these questions. Now what? What's the point? How do you use this? How do you apply it? So what we've already shown you is how to ask, what to ask. We've shown you how to analyze it, how to break it into professional, intermediate, and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Then what you want to look for is a range of questions. So is your workforce equal or unequal? Which is the dominant socioeconomic group? You want to then compare this proportion of both applicants and staff members from each socioeconomic background. So where in the pipeline, for example, if you get in your application stage only people from professional backgrounds or an overwhelming proportion, that's already going to tell you that upstream you need to start doing some work to reach out, do some outreach to different groups. If you have a really diverse set of applicants, but those actually getting through the door in your workforce is quite different to what your applicant base looks at, you need to target your hiring practices. So these are some of the questions you can be looking at after you've kind of looked at that workforce-wide data. We also then suggest you compare it against national benchmarks, and we're going to take a look at what those are in just a second. And if your business is not fairly representative, develop strategies, use interventions, visit our microsite, socialmobilityworks.org, for best practice and case studies to help you along that journey. The final thing we say is if you want to lead best practice and be among some of the very best in this agenda, be sure to publish your data. Not only internally is really, really important again. It is what will help you drive up response rates, as well as just being best practice. Be transparent. Even if the results are bad, you need to be able to say to your workforce, here's what this is, here's why we're working for it. And data can help you with that messaging. So show what you're trying to do and why this question is important. Your workforce will respond to that transparency. Then, to go that next mile, publish it externally too, and really show your commitment to talk about this data at the board level, and follow other guidance in our toolkit about how to lead best practice around your data. So I promised we would show some national benchmarks. Again, these are all up on the microsite, so you can take a look at this at your leisure. The key question, parental occupation at age 14, you can see there, this is the benchmark of the entire UK population, or I should say, I believe, the England population. So if you want to know, okay, what does my company look like compared to the working population? It's this. We then have, as you can see, the other benchmarks up on the site. And I should say, give a note, for some industries, we will be releasing industry-specific toolkits. So then, once you've looked at your workforce-wide diversity, the next step is to assess progression. Again, collect data from question number 1. Then what you need to do is break down your current workforce. So we can't help you terribly much on that because every workforce is structured a little bit differently. But essentially what you need to do is break down into grade levels or seniority. In the civil service, from where I'm employed, it's quite simple because we have very clear grade levels. So think about what that means for your structure. And what you need to do is see at each of those bands, at each grade level, what is the socioeconomic background at each grade level. And then what you're going to do is interpret those results. So does your data look like a pyramid, where as you rise up the ranks, it gets less and less diverse? Or does it have a cliff edge? Is there a moment? Maybe is it from associate to managing director? You know, is there a cliff edge, a fall off where suddenly you had some good diversity and then it massively falls off? That helps you target where to put those interventions. And then the final step on this, once you have that data, once you know what's happening, understand where those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds stop progressing and start listening. Set up listening sessions, talk to people. Best practice is to work with an expert like Nick at the Bridge Group, like Sam Friedman on our commission. Work with an expert to understand, do some qualitative research to hear and listen and figure out what those barriers are in your organization. And of course, also use our toolkit where we talk a fair bit about progression. You can also then do the exact same thing on apprenticeships. If you use apprenticeships, Again, I won't go through this. It's fairly representative, but one of the things I do want you to hear is that often we assume that apprenticeships are driving our social mobility strategy, and that is not the case. Our research, if you've attended our apprenticeship workshop, you will have seen in detail that our research shows that we cannot simply assume that apprenticeships, by virtue of themselves, are driving our socioeconomic diversity and inclusion strategy forward. So again, use that same question, that one key question, the parental occupation question, to analyze apprentices, your overall apprenticeship diversity, completion rates by socioeconomic background, level. Are disadvantaged apprentices stuck at level 2 and level 3, and more privileged apprentices up at those higher levels? That's what we see nationally. So check it against your workforce. And again, progression. What's the so what of the apprenticeship? After finishing that apprentice, where do they move on? Do they get a promotion within a certain number of years? Do they move on to a higher level of apprenticeship? Think about what your goals are in that apprenticeship strategy and use your data to assess whether you're doing it correctly. And again, there are more resources and tools for this up on our microsite. Finally, if you are amongst the best and you're already quite mature in your social mobility strategy, we have created a tool that we've called the scorecard. We had organizations reach out to us that said, look, we've been doing this for years. We want to understand what targets we should be setting in all of the areas like outreach, hiring, progression, culture, etc. So we've worked, again, really closely with our partners at the Social Mobility Foundation, where we use data from the Social Mobility Employers Index to benchmark best practice. This scorecard is available up on our microsite again, and it will help you figure out what key performance indicators you want to set in each area of your socioeconomic diversity and inclusion strategy. And then it'll allow you to look across at best practice. So of those people entering the index, what are the kind of, general things that they are working for? Now, that's it from me. I'm going to hand back over to Nina. So thank you all again for being here. If we have time, we'll answer questions either now or at the end. And again, I just would encourage folks to go visit that socialmobilityworks.org to take a look at the data kit, national benchmarks, as well as that scorecard. So Nina, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. We are slightly over, but there's a couple of good questions I just wanted to throw to you, Lindsay, if you're able to answer them succinctly. That's my request. One is, if organisations have been using the 4-part question already, so they've got a bank of data, how or are you able, is there a logical way for them to be able to match their old data set against their new data set that they'll be collecting?
Absolutely. So if you've been asking the 4-part question and you've been analyzing it, what you should have gotten spit out is the same result as what you'll get with the 1-part. So the 4-part question returns to you a kind of 3-coded background: professional, intermediate, and working class background. That's exactly the same as the 1-part version will spit out to you. So absolutely, you can transition from 4 to 1. Again, the trade-off is very slightly less accuracy on the 1-part version, but we determined that it wasn't a massive risk. So we stand behind the 1-part question. So that is absolutely up to you.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And then there's an interesting one, which may be something you take away and consider when we come back at the end. But it was, how would you recommend doing intersectional socioeconomic status analysis?
That's a great question. It's really going to be dependent on your analytical capability. So it's very simple to do from an analysis perspective if you have your data set in one place. So let's say you have your 3-part responses to that parental occupation question, and you've got people's gender, and you've got their BAME background. Your analysts just do something that the analytical community calls a cross-tab. So you cross-tabulate low socioeconomic background with BAME or with gender, and it will spit you out what is that intersectional result. It's a brilliant question. It's really important. We didn't cover it here because we didn't know what complexity folks might want to go into. But I'm going to take that away and have a think on what we could do on our microsite to kind of support folks wanting to do that level of analysis.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. There's a couple of others, so I'm going to keep those to the end, because now we're going to move over to our speakers. So Lindsay, if you could drive onto the next slide, and I can just introduce our speakers for us. So as I mentioned, I'm pleased to say we've got some great representatives of how to use data. So we've got James King from Compass. He's going to take the stage first, and then we're going to go through to Laura Yeats from Clifford Chance, Andrew Young from the BBC, and then finally with Phil Wilson from the Cabinet Office. So James, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. Yeah, if we could go on to the next slides. Great, thank you. So we're at the very start of our journey, so we're going to sort of progress through different companies, and we're very much at the start of our data story when it comes to social mobility, but we're not at the start of our journey when it comes to supporting sort of social mobility initiatives and getting the basics in place. So for those of you that don't know, Compass is the world's largest catering and support services company. We provide services across all industries, public and private sector. And in the UK, we have over 40,000 colleagues working across 6,000 different client locations, and everything from schools, hospitals and military bases to offices, factories and sporting venues. So what's fantastic about Compass is, given our size and scale, we're sort of uniquely positioned to really affect change for our colleagues' lives and the lives of their families, really, you know, all across the UK. And because we're in the hospitality sector, you know, there really aren't any barriers to joining the business. There's no qualification barriers. We've always been known for providing great opportunities and careers and supporting people to develop at all levels, and that's what we do. We have some good we have career pathways to support people. If you're a kitchen porter or a chef joining us, or an apprentice, there's a really clear career pathway to progress your career to become a head chef or an executive chef, or senior management. And we do have lots of stories of people joining us as apprentices and progressing up and onwards through the organisation. And we do track our apprentices, actually, but it's a really great point that I think Lindsay was mentioning earlier. We know we have good progression of our apprentices, but at the moment, and this is where we'll get onto the kind of need to understand more, we don't know the different socio-economic backgrounds of those apprentices. So we know they progress well in general. Are they skewed towards certain different socio-economic backgrounds? And then we've just recently, actually, which is great for our industry, we are the lowest paid industry in the UK, the hospitality industry, and particularly at the moment, we've just recently signed up to the Real Living Wage Foundation as a recognised service provider. And I think the more I learn about social mobility as sort of attending these classes, and the more I read, it's so fundamental to supporting the life chances of people to pay that real living wage. So, really pleased that we've been able to commit to that. And we also do some great outreach stuff with external partnerships as well. We're not the experts in all different areas, so we reach out to our external partnerships. Springboard is one, but we have many, and Springboard specifically support people from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds, and we work with them to sort of place them and develop careers for them within the hospitality industry. And on top of that, as you'd expect, a company of sort of our size and scale, we have our sort of established D&I groups and inclusion groups, and we're always sort of listening to our different groups and internal experts and external experts in terms of how we can progress the various different agendas. So some strong foundations, I think, for us as a business. We feel, and we've always felt, that we are a business that, regardless of your background, anyone can join. We don't have the barriers that you might have in other professions, and people can and do get on. But I think the key thing is here, and this is why the data is so important to us, is that need to understand more. So we think we're okay. We've got great anecdotal evidence. We've got some great studies, but what we really want to understand now is actually how widespread is the impact from a social economic background. We know we have some challenges in some areas. So some of our smaller units, progression isn't as widespread as it is in some of our bigger units. So we're not supporting our people as well to progress through the organisation. And we also know from some of our D&I data that equal progression doesn't always seem to appear at all levels in all groups. So this is what we always need to understand more about these different groups. So I'm really pleased that from next year, we are going to be including in our employee survey, we've always included D&I questions actually, but from February, we will be including specific social mobility questions. And the great thing is that we can do those sort of interrelational results, so we can split when we get the data back, and when we analyse it, we'll be able to say, okay, by different grade, by different job level, how are we doing in terms of social mobility, also by different ethnic backgrounds, gender, all those different characteristics. We will be diving into analysis, understanding where we do this well, and then really doing that analysis to drive further interventions. So very excited. We're very much at the start of our journey when it comes to measuring social mobility data. But I think the key message is, whilst the data obviously is super important, I think hopefully what I've been able to demonstrate is that you can do lots of really good interventions that we know support great social mobility without your data, because we haven't got data yet, but we already have done some good stuff. So don't need the data to start, but I think definitely we've got to the stage where we believe we need the data to take us to the next level.
Right. Thank you very much, James. That was brilliant. Thank you, James. Lindsay, if you could move over to the next one. Now we've got Andrew up. Thank you.
Hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me okay. I think the BBC is partway through its journey on socioeconomic diversity, and we kind of began about 3 years ago, and we sort of started to feel that we needed to do a lot more around socioeconomic diversity, and obviously we've been doing lots of diversity and inclusion activity for a long time, but socioeconomic diversity seemed somewhere that we needed to start to sort of develop change and interventions. And the BBC is quite a data-driven organisation, and so data collection seemed like the best place to start before we started kind of developing some of the interventions. And I think we also wanted to try and sort of maybe distinguish between the kind of fact and fiction. I think there's this perception that the BBC is kind of a bit posh and middle class and exclusionary, and we just kind of wanted to sort of know what the actual kind of picture was. So we partnered with Bridge Group, who helped us develop our questions, and these were based on the work that they've been doing with the civil service, and obviously, as we've just kind of heard, those kind of three key questions we asked, which was around parental occupation, parental degree, and the type of school that the member of staff went to. We could have asked the free school meals question, but for us, having quite a lot of staff who are educated outside the UK, it was felt that was perhaps less appropriate, and also because it was part of a kind of a wider diversity questionnaire, we just needed to sort of tighten up a little bit, so we kept to those three areas. As I said, these questions were part of a wider D&I census, and that data is then stored on the individual's HR record, obviously in a very secure area that's only accessible to just a handful of people within HR that run reports on D&I data, so it's not even available to HR business partners, directors, etc., and obviously certainly not line managers. But because it's held as part of the HR record, it's not a snapshot census. It is kept up to date as people join and leave the organisation, and so new joiners are also asked those questions as well. So that gave us a sort of picture of our diversity, and we publish that in our annual report each year, and I have it here, the telephone directory sized document. So if you want to have a look at that, it's towards the back of that report. That's on our website. And that breaks down all of the different areas of diversity and inclusion, and obviously those 3 areas of socioeconomic diversity. But that is only about 60% of our staff we have that data for. As I said, it's sort of growing all the time, very slightly as people kind of leave and join the organisation, and I'll answer that questionnaire, but we will be asking those questions again of all our existing staff soon. But that data that's published in the annual report and where we'd kind of got to with our data analysis was quite sort of high level. It was just sort of, these are where people are in the organisation, these are their departments, grades, pay, etc. But it didn't really go into much detail about people's career progression rates. So we wanted to kind of understand more about that. So we engaged with the Bridge Group again to do some kind of in-depth data research on our staff to sort of understand if coming from a lower socioeconomic background affected your ability to move through the organisation. And it's a little tricky, our organisation, unlike the civil service, it's not a linear progression journey at all. You can come into the organisation and sort of stay on the same grade, but still kind of move around the organisation. I've been at BBC for 10 years and have only moved up 1 grade in that time, and hopefully that's not a reflection of my abilities, but just in terms of the way that the organisation is sort of structured. So you can kind of move around and you can often get paid quite a lot of difference between those areas, but your grades aren't the same. So I think it wasn't very sort of, I suppose, overly conclusive in that. But what the data did show is that it can take you longer to progress your career if you are from a lower socioeconomic background. And I don't think that was necessarily a surprise to us. I think it's, you know, obviously not easy to see when it's there in black and white on the paper. But you know, the BBC's new Director General, Tim Davie, acknowledged the fact that we need to move away from this sense of a kind of BBC type and individual leaders hiring in their own image. He spoke about that in his opening speech when he took over the role a few months ago. And so we know that this is something that we need to work more on. This culture that we have at the BBC, we need to address, and the diversity and inclusion strategy that we will be publishing in the new year will hopefully go some way towards that. So we've got the data in the annual report. We also know that that isn't necessarily reflective of the diversity of the UK, and being public service broadcaster, licence fee payers throughout the country, all are paying the license fee. And so that's really our kind of business case for diversity, is reflecting the diversity of the UK and ensuring that the organisation is making programmes that everyone wants to watch. So I think, like a lot of organisations, we make a lot of effort around our new intake programmes, our grad programmes, apprenticeships, etc. Where perhaps we need to do more on is around experienced hires, and as I say, creating a culture that is more inclusive to people from all sorts of backgrounds. And in the new year, we will be running the diversity inclusion census again. That will build on the data that we've already got, hopefully going above that 60%. It was interesting to hear earlier that sort of the target should be for organisations that are a little bit along the journey like we are, should be around 70%. So we'll certainly be aiming to achieve that. And I think at that point, we may look to set a target. The BBC has lots of diversity targets around the protected characteristics. We don't have one at the moment around socioeconomic diversity. So I think we'll be reviewing that as well in the new year. So I think, you know, changing the diversity of the organisation, getting more people in is going to take time. What we do have more control of in the shorter term is, as I say, that kind of culture piece and ensuring that we've created an environment which is truly inclusive of everyone to be able to be themselves. because we also asked the Bridge Group to do some qualitative research as well, which they did for us last summer. And in that research, we heard that staff feel that the organisation is this kind of high politics, high culture environment, where fitting in can be quite hard to do unless you've grown up with those references, and people often feel that they either need to assimilate, change who they are in order to fit in and to sort of progress their careers, or they feel that the organisation is not for them. They don't want to fit in, they can't fit in, and so ultimately leave the organisation. So I don't think either of those things we want to happen. We want to retain diverse talent. We want people to feel that they can be themselves in the organisation. And so again, that diversity and inclusion plan that we will be publishing in the new year will have lots of interventions and aspirations and plans in place in order to change the culture of the organisation to make sure that it is truly inclusive for everyone. So I think that's probably all I want to say. I think, you know, as I say, we are on our journey, learning all the time. I think we've come kind of a long way in the sort of last 2 or 3 years, but really good to kind of hear from everyone today and to sort of learn from each other. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that very detailed explanation of what you're doing at the BBC. And I know there's some questions that have come in, which I'll throw out to yourself and James, along with your colleagues at the end. So, okay, Lindsay, sure. If you're happy to move on to the next one, we've got Laura.
Yeah, I'm Laura, Head of Graduate Talent at Clifford Chance. And I suppose I'm going to take this from the question of why did we actually do this? What was our motivation to collect the data? And for us, it was all about understanding, and this is some of the stuff Lindsay was touching on earlier, where our barriers existed. And we felt we couldn't just rely on the qualitative stuff. It was useful, but data really has got people to listen. So we've been collecting data since back in 2014. We've added some more questions in the last 2 years, but we've got a fairly big data set. But when I think of our data sets, they fall into 2 camps. We've got what I would argue is the really easy stuff, because it's the stuff that is to do with entry level, which would typically sit in your applicant tracking systems. And because they sit in your applicant tracking systems, most of your candidates applying will complete it. So you get these beautifully full data sets to analyse. And then you have the other data sets, which are when you think about your workforce and progression, which can be more challenging. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But at entry level, we got this real full data set, and we were able to do some really interesting real-time analysis of campaigns, looking for barriers, identifying those barriers, and then taking real-time interventions to tackle those barriers for the subsequent campaigns. And really, building this data set allowed us to see our year-on-year progression and how we were performing when we were making these interventions. So what did these interventions look like? What were we doing with that data? What were the practical, tangible changes that came from that? Well, a couple of examples, some tangible things around moving the group exercise, because we saw that was a barrier for certain groups. And there's a lot of intersectionality here between social mobility and BAME, but removing the group exercises was one of the first steps. We moved to CV blind recruiting. We introduced contextual recruitment. We got rid of our UCAS requirements. We've introduced a completely different model of targeting, introducing global virtual internships, and also less targeting of those target unis, so really widening our net. And importantly, we were sharing this data publicly. So this information that we were getting in terms of our campaign analysis and looking at progression throughout the different stages of the selection process, we shared publicly on our website. The other pool, which is the more challenging pool, is the HR system, the progression system data. And this is really dependent, as you know, on completion rates, which can be really, really challenging. So we've currently got a program running to drive completion rates up. It's a series of videos called The 6 Reasons Why, with people talking about why data completion is so very, very important. But when it comes to looking at our data sets, internally once they're in the organisation. We've used a whole host of external support. We've worked with Rare, with Piracle, with the Bridge Group to really crunch the data. Much of this has stemmed from our work on ethnicity, from the gender pay gap to the ethnicity pay gap, but also then covering all of the intersectionalities and shining a light on some of those social mobility angles. And many of the interventions have been very similar. What we've put into place to deal with some of those barriers that have been evident for our BAME population are also the same interventions that we've put into place from a social mobility perspective. So some of those interventions have been hemisphere training, which has just been launched by Rare, looking at reducing bias, introducing inclusion advocates within the organisation, looking at introducing firm-wide reverse mentoring, and perhaps most importantly, firm-wide targets. So recognising that data is important to analyse, crunch, critique what you're doing, but also putting into place targets, hard targets, to enable us to see our progression towards where we want to go. I think for us, some of the challenges around crunching the data at that stage when we're looking at progression has been trying to collect the data to analyse when we're looking at perhaps work allocation or partner contact, if it's from a fee earner perspective, or the amount of client contact individuals have had, and thinking about every single thing that needs to be analysed when we're trying to identify those barriers. So that's been pretty challenging for us. But for me, the power of data is really about, I think, probably two things. It's about industry benchmarking. So this is really important to me. It enables me to know what my industry, my legal sector, my early talent professionals are doing and how we're comparing against that. And also collecting stories, not just the hard data, but individual stories. And I think that's really helped us amplify and accelerate some of the pace of change that we've wanted to see within the organisation. And I think using that with the complementary hard data has really allowed us to get significant investment into some of these initiatives and some of this sense of urgency and pace. So in summary, I think some of this has been gut instinct. You'll know stuff inherently from working in this field, from seeing qualitative data to listening to individual stories. And that can be incredibly powerful in terms of pushing forward for change and just getting on with it and finding solutions. But actually, the hard data is ultimately what you need to get that investment and push things through with a sense of urgency. So that's my take on it.
Brilliant, thank you, Laura. And it was nice for you to bring in that intersectionality piece, because I know we've had that as a question already. So thank you for sharing that, how you've done that. And Lindsay, if you could move over now, it's over to Phil.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to listen to colleagues and see the questions as well. It's a fascinating area and one that in the civil service we've been very much committed to over quite a few years now, and it's one that's growing all the time in terms of our approach and the approach of other employers. So we're very keen to continue to evolve the analysis that we do. We kicked things off about 2011. We really wanted to try to get on top of this issue of social mobility and have a good, clear way of measuring socioeconomic background. We chose, in fact, to go with the occupation approach. That seemed to make sense. It seemed to align with other approaches that were being undertaken with the Office of National Statistics or UCAS and other bodies that were using occupation. So delighted to sort of press on with that. But what that did tell us, and it's the sort of power of data that Laura was talking about, and the importance of having the data, that we weren't really moving. We plateaued quite significantly from 2011 onwards, and that was a concern, of course. So we were very pleased to get Nick and the Bridge Group over to do work with us, and that was a game changer. It really was terrific to have their insights, and we looked at how we measured socioeconomic background and all the other additional measures around messaging and outreach and fast tracking the diverse candidates, and then moving towards really important changes to the selection approach and so forth. So there was a great deal that we did through the Bridge Group, and we're very pleased to get all those recommendations that were put forward by the Bridge Group implemented. So we were, really delighted to sort of move on. And since then, we've been able to certainly in the first year double our success rate for socioeconomic background, for lower socioeconomic background in the graduate world on our fast stream program. And then we've continued to have better representation at application stage and success rate as well, year by year, from 2016 all the way through to the current day, and we're pleased that there has been that progress. We did update our measurement approach, as maybe quite a few different organisations did, with the civil service recommendations in March 2018. That was a very useful document, and again, occupation was part of that, as well as a few other mechanisms, and we've tried to adopt them, those approaches since then, and we've been really interested to see, for example, on the self-evaluation measure, do you consider yourself from a working class background or lower socioeconomic background? And very, very interested with the work that Lindsay was citing earlier about how we measure occupation going forward, and in a simpler format, and that's quite appealing, I must say, for lots of reasons. We've been developing our overall D&I strategy, as probably lots of organisations have, especially this year, really, with so many triggers to really make sure that we get things right around socioeconomic background, but of course in terms of ethnic minority background and so forth. So we've been looking at attraction and representation, and looking at inclusion as well, of course, and how we measure inclusion, including those, of course, from different backgrounds, such as socioeconomic backgrounds or lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And certainly we've been looking at, the theme of, getting our in-post staff to actually complete the metrics. It's easy, as Laura was saying, to get our applicants to do that, but for getting in-post staff to do that is a challenge. Our target at the moment is to get around 70 to 80% of our in-post staff to complete the demographics around socioeconomic background and all the other diversity characteristics. So we're aiming for that. Hopefully in the next few weeks is our sort of plan of action on that. We're doing campaigns, as a number of you might be, to try and boost those completions. Intersectionality has come up a few times already in this webinar, so it's quite perhaps relevant. I can mention that, although we do call it cross-cutting rather than intersectionality in terms of government, which seems to have a sort of a slightly broader focus, not just on diversity characteristics. It could include regions, for example, different regions in the country. So it's a slightly more broader concept. Anyway, in terms of intersection analysis or cross-cutting analysis, as I think it was Lindsay who was saying, you can do cross tabs. This is a statistical analysis technique. Hopefully there's somebody in your organization who's able to do that. So you need obviously statistics package at the very least. So we've done that analysis on the outcomes of our processes in terms of, you could do it on application data, or you could do it on appointment data or other data perhaps. So if you look at appointment data, you could look at, say, socioeconomic background and disability. And then you could look at, okay, are the people who are appointed more likely to be from higher socioeconomic background and not be disabled, or is it the case that they could be from a higher socioeconomic background and are disabled, or lower socioeconomic and not disabled, and any sort of combination around that. On that particular sort of combination, we didn't find anything significant on disability and socioeconomic background. There was some more significant data on some of the other sort of mixes of characteristics, but obviously it triggers analysis. And what can you do to address some of those points? we were lucky enough to have Bridge Group join us again in 2020, in other words, earlier this year, and they did some target group analysis in terms of which universities we should be targeting in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of ethnic minority background, and in terms of STEM as well. And Nick was looking at, our historical success rates with particular universities, and also more general data around which are the more diverse universities. And that was really helpful. And we applied all Nick's recommendations, which hopefully you'll be pleased about, in terms of the target university list. And I think we had pretty good success in terms of the mix of diversity this year, the campaign, which is certainly closed for applications. And then finally, just to mention intersectionality again, and this is something that's very recent for us. What we've been doing is, when we do pass mark setting for, let's say, the graduate program, we have been looking at, for quite a few years now, we've been looking at specific diversity categories. So you could look at ethnic minority performance. Is it higher or lower than the white group performance at different stages, from our online tests to video interview to assessment centers, how does that look? So we've been doing that, but actually we wanted to take it further and look at the intersectional elements. And is it the case that perhaps lower socioeconomic candidates who are disabled are doing less well than other candidates who might be from higher socioeconomic background or who aren't disabled? Is there some sort of impact of having one or more diversity characteristics, and is that triggering some significant difference? And particularly when you set pass marks, if you set the pass mark here, does that actually incur those sorts of intersectional outcomes which are concerning? So we've been looking at that. We looked at it this morning, just to take an example. We were looking at the video interview stage, which is our phase 3 of the fast stream selection process. And we were looking at any combination. So there's I think 16 combinations that we were looking at, such as somebody who is from lower socioeconomic background, who is female, and has a disability. And so you could have those combinations together. Is it the case that that mix of people are actually less successful than other people? So what we did, we took all of those combinations, including the socioeconomic background, and put them over the non-diverse groups of male, of non-disabled, of higher socioeconomic, and so on, and put them over that on all of those combinations for, in this case, video interview. And we didn't find any significant results in terms of intersectional outcomes. That was really helpful, because there are concerns that maybe somebody, as I say, who has a disability and from a lower socioeconomic background is going to do less well at certain stages in the selection process. I'll stop there, but that sort of gives you a flavour of some of the work that we've been doing in terms of data analysis and trying to really support the whole area of social mobility and really continue to take things forward in this particular arena. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Phil. And actually, we've got some questions for your peer presenters, but I'm going to put one to you for you to think about. I think now you're very much advanced in your journey. I guess my one question to yourself, which I'll let you consider, would be, if you're at the start of this journey, so you're wanting to start to collect data, what would be that golden nugget you would recommend someone doing as kind of from the onset? So before I get your answer, I'll give you time to think. I'm going to go over to Andrew. Andrew, we've had a few questions with regards to BBC. I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at them, but there's a couple that I'll throw at you in the time that we have. So One was with regards to the not asking the free school meal question. And it was just a couple of questions came in, which was, it felt, given obviously that we ourselves at the Commission had recommended using this, it was just wondering why was it specifically left out, and actually is it something you would reconsider including it in the future?
Yeah, it is something. As I say, we started this, we started collecting the data about 3 years ago. We started kind of looking at it sort of 3.5, 4 years ago. I think there was a lot less advice out there at that time. As I said, for the reason that we felt lots of our people were educated outside the UK, and also just for the, we were already adding 3 questions for the diversity census, 4 just kind of felt a little bit too much. I think the advice has kind of moved on since then. If we had our time again, we probably, on your advice and Nick's at the Bridge Group as well, not necessarily ask the question around the parental degree, the parental education question, but instead do the free school meals question. So it's not been finalised yet, and we're still discussing really what will be in that new census that we'll do in January, and free school meals may well be part of that, but we'll kind of look at that.
Brilliant, thank you. And then there was just one other, if I can ask you while I've got you. There was a question from Ray. She said about the Sutton Trust has identified 29% of BBC executives attended independent schools. Are you doing any further analysis to track this by department and look at how this happens?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's part of the work that Nick has done for us to understand people's career progression journeys. I mean, 8 out of 10 of our overall workforce were educated in state schools, but that does fall quite a lot once you get to those senior levels. We want to make sure that we're bringing people into the organisation, and I think we do that at that kind of entry-level scheme, but that takes a long time to get up to the senior leader position. So it's about kind of developing that kind of career progression journey for everyone. We've got a staff network now for socioeconomic diversity called Raised, and I think they're doing great things for kind of creating a more kind of inclusive culture as well, so that people can kind of feel they want to stay in the organisation, feel they're getting that kind of mentoring and sponsorship, and can kind of progress up to those senior positions. That all takes time, and we're sort of on that journey already.
And Phil, before I come to yourself to answer that question I'm just going to throw on to James for him to think about. I realise, James, for yourself, you're at the start of the journey when it comes to data, but what you have demonstrated that you've already got a very solid culture when it comes to inclusivity, especially from individuals from so many different backgrounds. So I just wondered how you're going to land that communication piece to help drive up that data, because obviously Lindsay mentioned about the communication, and that's how you can help get great data results. So I'm going to ask that to you, but in the meantime I'm going to go back to Phil just to see if he's had a chance to think about the golden nugget he would pose to individuals going on this journey from the onset.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just 2, if I may. One is, I think the thing about having just a single question for occupation sounds quite, unimportant, but it actually will make a huge difference. It is a barrier if you have to ask 4 questions and then combine the outcomes to get the socioeconomic background information. To have 1 question, and you don't need to do any more analysis, is incredible. That will make a huge difference. That would make a huge difference to us if we would have been starting what we did back in 2011 or 2016. So that's a big one. And the other one is that when we did our work initially about what we were going to do about social mobility, it was recruitment focused. I think what would have been good if we had the ambition was to look at progression as well simultaneously. We've sort of left it to a later stage to look at progression and inclusion, but if we started earlier and really start to get that culture element in place as quickly as possible, that would have given us accelerated our progress and improvement, I think, if we'd done it that way.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil. And progression has been very much a hot topic, I think, from conversations we've been having of late with organisations. There's great work around outreach and hiring, and progression now is the thing that really people need to tackle. So actually, James, now over to you really. So how do you think you're going to land the great culture you have, how you can use that to influence your communication when you're going out to collect this data?
Yeah, so I think the good thing for us, or the advantage that we've got, is we're going to be inserting this into our existing sort of employee survey. And we have tremendous, levels of feedback from that. So typically we've got about, just over 40,000 employees. We will get over 30,000 responses from our employee survey. the key thing is for us is, of course, they don't have to answer every question. So we want as many of those sort of 30,000 plus responses to answer this question. So I think as Lindsay said earlier, for me, it's about the what and the why. So what are we asking? Is what's new, this survey, and why are we asking? And importantly, why does it fit with our sort of culture? And we have sort of quite a strong culture around respect and growth and teamwork, and these really fit, particularly with respect and growth of our employees. So we'll kind of, I guess, position it in line with the values that we kind of talk to our teams about anyway. So I'm hoping and expecting, to be honest, a good, strong response rate to these questions.
Thank you, James. And thank you to our panellists. I'm afraid Laura had to leave early, so if there's any questions for Laura, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can ask her and send that out with our after packs. So Lindsay, if you could happily move on, I'd like now to introduce Nick, who's gratefully joined us on the call, and he's going to take us through a bit more of what he does best. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks Nina, and thanks Lindsay as well. I think you just need to enable me to share my screen, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Nick. I am. If folks can just bear with us, we're going to just do a quick swap around. Whilst we're doing this, and whilst Nick is hopefully seamlessly able to share his screen, I want to just call out a massive thank you to Izzy, who caught a mistake that I missed on our slide deck on how to categorize, how to code responses. I've already corrected this behind the scenes. So in the pack that you get out following the session, you will receive the updated, corrected amount. It's correct on our microsite too. So please just be aware when you actually officially go to code your responses from that one question survey, just make sure you're using the deck that comes to you after the session and the results that are up on our microsite. And again, thank you very much to Izzy for catching that mistake. Really appreciate it. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thank you. And Lindsay, just to check in with you and Nina, I think I'm aiming for about 15-20 minutes, yeah?
Yeah, that sounds good, Nick.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks very much. And it's been fascinating to hear other colleagues talking as well. So as Nina kindly mentioned, I'm Nick Miller, the Chief Executive at the Bridge Group. And I was going to kick off just by picking up on a point that Laura made earlier, which is that we know in the work that we've done with many, many employers, this is about people, about how we understand ourselves, how we perceive talent and value in others, how we choose to interact with people daily. So that qualitative data is absolutely vital. And I want to sort of finish on that point and start with it. But we also know that the data, the quantitative data really, really matters, as you've been hearing from James, Andrew, Laura and Phil as well this afternoon. And our strong view is that that's what's creating the sort of change. And I hope to convince you of that as I talk through this. We know that without the data, progress is likely to be pretty slow. If I reflect on some of the really important changes that have happened around gender diversity, and goodness me, there's still a lot to do there, it's been the data that has helped bust some myths and promote change. So we really value our collaboration with the Social Mobility Commission. So thank you for enabling me to spend some time with you this afternoon. And I hope very much to build on and tie together some of the themes that colleagues have been hearing from the 4 case studies earlier today. So I wanted to talk about why data collection matters, although you're probably convinced of that already, so I'll be brief. What to do with the data once you've got it, and particularly to look at benchmarking, about how we make sense of the data. And you've been hearing about some of that from colleagues as well, of course. What good looks like. So how would we know if this problem was solved? With respect to what the data was showing us, and then to pick up on some of James's reflections there, how to get good response rates, and actually how to make this relevant to organisational purpose and strategy. And I understand there are colleagues on the call who are sort of at different stages in the journey. I hope there's something in here for everyone. But do post messages in the Q&A box and the chat box, and I'll adapt what I say as well to suit the audience. So data is your friend. I'm going to whiz through my slides pretty quickly, I have to say. If you're finding that frustrating, fear not, because I know there'll be a pack that goes out after the session. So let's start with what's the point of collecting the data? Well, the first point here is pretty obvious, to understand what's happening. I find it deeply suspicious if we talk to an organisation who says, oh yes, we've cared about this for years, but they don't know at all about the workforce kind of patterning within their own organisation. But of course, the main point of collecting the data really is to inform action, to focus action and activity in the areas where it will make the most difference, and to understand whether things are actually making a difference. So to benchmark progress over time with peer organizations, to understand what's working. And I think it's fair to say, and I say this with admiration to lots of the firms that are on the call today, the evidence base about what really makes the difference here is pretty thin. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that historically we have all invested a lot of energy in creating initiatives and much less in evaluating them and understanding what's making the most difference. And with various papers on that topic if you're interested. And of course the data is key to that. Data is also really good, I've found, particularly when you're presenting to boards, at busting some myths. And here are my favourite 3 myths which we have helped bust with data. Myth 1, things will naturally get better over time. Look, we're more diverse at junior levels. Just give us a decade or 2 or 3, and the levels of diversity will flow through the company and we will be enlightened and more diverse. All of the data that we've handled in organizations suggests that will not be the case. And let me substantiate that with some examples. Myth number 2, lots of people, we all want to work for a meritocratic employer. Most people we interview, the conversation tends to start around the logic that, talent and hard work is what gets you ahead around here. Once you're in, the playing field is level, and as long as you work hard and you're good at your job, you'll get ahead. Lots of the data we've looked at around progression begins to challenge that particular definition of meritocracy. The third myth I'll come back to at the end, if I may. So certainly with organisations, and I'm not going to talk about what data to collect because I know Lindsay's covered that in an expert and detailed way already and that colleagues have reflected on it. Our strong advice is to really be clear about what questions you're trying to answer in the data, because you can easily, as I've discovered over many years, get submerged in the data. And I think the key question people want to know is how diverse is our organisation by socioeconomic background, including horizontally by area. Does it vary by occupational type? So Andrew, I don't know if you had a chance to talk about the difference at the BBC, for example, in something like commissioning compared to those working in more administrative roles in the regions, for example, and also vertically by seniority. We see the same patterning with socioeconomic background data that most of us are used to seeing in relation to diversity data relating to gender or race. Or disability fill, as you mentioned earlier. Levels of diversity decrease as seniority increases. But the really key thing to understand here, and it's pretty intuitive, is what is that diversity a construct of? So if we want to understand how we can make a difference to that diversity, we really need to be looking at these 3 areas. Who gets in to our organisation? And Phil, I was really interested to hear about some of the progressive work at the fast stream around the marking at different tests and stages. Who sticks around? So are people leaving disproportionately based on different diversity characteristics? And then really, really importantly, who gets ahead? Who progresses and how? And of course, the way to make sense of lots of this data is to benchmark it against time. Are things getting better or worse? And other relevant data points, of course, against peer organizations. And I'll share some examples of that shortly. And I'm really encouraged and relieved that the topic of intersectionality or cross-cutting, as it is at the fast stream, has come up, because this has become such an important aspect to our work. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So I'll be sharing some practical examples of the data and whizzing through them pretty swiftly. So on the basis of having collected the data, here's the type of data representation you might expect to find. So the data I'm sharing here, I should actually preface this by saying the data I'm sharing is all either published or I've been given permission to share it. So this is the data for the collection of financial services organisations we published a report on just last week. So we can tell from this chart that 56% of the respondents to the surveys were from a higher socioeconomic background. And let me just footnote this by saying the language that we use at the Bridge Group is of higher and lower socioeconomic background and intermediate. Some organisations, including the Commission, of course, choose to use working class, I think, for lower socioeconomic background, and professional for higher. So these are synonymous. So I think if I were a board member looking at this, I would think, well, is that good or is that bad? I have a sense with gender diversity data that 50-50 feels like a good place to be moving towards. Here, little idea. So we can start to look at data by levels of seniority. And again, this is 8 leading financial services firms. When I share the slides, I'll include the references, of course. So we can now begin to understand about the patterning of the workforce. And again, this is to my point earlier about diversity decreasing as we get to more senior levels. I've been in board meetings where even this type of data is quite surprising to people. This type of patterning, I think, would apply to most organisations that we've worked with. So we're in the board meeting and the chair says, well, okay, that's us. How are we doing compared with others? And so when we move to the next slide, this is a slightly different data set. We can start to look at benchmarking data. So in this chart, we're looking at the percentage of respondents from a higher socioeconomic background. This is the parental occupation indicator that I know Lindsay talked about in detail earlier. So we can look at this against other benchmarked populations. And one of the real reasons why the parental occupation indicator is so useful is that it's used in the labour force survey. So we can start to say, okay, 51% of the respondents to this survey, these are people working across different areas in these banks, were from a higher socioeconomic background. That doesn't look particularly good compared to the overall working population. That figure now, of course, is 34%. This is the figure from last year when we produced the research. And we can start to benchmark against other populations. And so even within a bank, we can start to say, well, the bank has different types of occupations. It has legal counsel, it has investment managers, consultants, accountants. So we can start to say, well, how do people in those areas compare to the labour force in England based on the labour force survey? So here we're starting to benchmark to get a sense of this not looking particularly good. And of course, we can do this organisationally as well. So here's that same data, the 51% across all respondents, and the data by organisation. We can see there's quite a significant amount of variance. So as an organisation, you can start to be thinking, well, why would it be so different? And of course, we know there are a variety of reasons for that. The two main ones in the data being geography. So organisation G, one might assume, and it does, have a much more regional footprint compared to organisation A, and also occupational kind of composition. What are the types of jobs that the majority of people are doing? Are they on the trading floor, or are they working out in the regions in retail banks? And I think my main point here is that we can start then to to intersect the data. So we can start to understand things like, does this look better in a London office compared to others, for example? Trying to answer this question, what is the challenge that we're trying to address? So you could probably draw this if I asked you to, but here's the data from a large accountancy firm looking at the different levels of seniority on the x-axis, along with London and non-London, and then the percentage of the workforce in each of these cross-sectored areas that went to independent school. So we can see that there's a general trend, the blue diagonal line, towards a higher proportion of people attending independent school based on level of seniority, but also this disparity that people in London are much more likely to have attended an independent school. These are useful data points to help understand then how we might target interventions and change. And then starting to look at similar data by occupational area, and this will be more or less relevant to different organizations, but even some SMEs we work with have a diverse range of types of occupations. And again, this is a different large accountancy firm, and accountancy firms are typically made up of these 4 sort of professional areas, as it were, and we see this patterning typically in most firms that we work with. And there's a wonderful program, if you haven't come across it before, and I think Holly is on the line, Access Accountancy, where accountancy firms come together to share this data. So here we can see at this firm that the level of socioeconomic diversity in advisory, just as at the BBC in commissioning, for example, is more of a challenge compared to some other areas. And if we want to start to understand why that should be, that's where the qualitative data comes in. This also relates to target setting on socioeconomic diversity. I don't know if that's come up in the conversation already, where the target for advisory might be different than the target compared with, for example, support. I don't have time to tell you why the data is so different in these areas, but if you're interested, we've written lots about it. I have 4 more data slides and then some final comments, but Lindsay, Nina, I know you won't be shy in telling me to stop if I need to. I want to introduce the idea of external data, as Phil referenced earlier. So here I'm going to talk briefly about attraction and selection, and then finally talk about progression. So there's a lot on this slide. This is external data from HESA, from the university's data body, the Higher Education Stats Agency. And here what we've looked at for a law firm is the number of students studying law at each of these institutions, the blue and green bar being the numbers of students, the blue bar being the number of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, just studying law and graduating this year, and then the percentage of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, this type of data I think is really invaluable, as Phil helpfully described, at targeting efforts more effectively, and also setting realistic expectations. So if you've managing partners in your law firm, for example, who are saying, you know, we must continue to go to the University of Durham, why pick on them, I don't know, but we want to massively increase our lower socioeconomic background intake at graduate level. Here's some data to say, well, there are 12 students graduating from that university in law this coming year. So this is external data, which match then, of course, with your recruitment data, can provide some really valuable insights. I'm going to talk about success rates and then about progression. So here we start to think about matters of intersectionality and the relationship between variables. So this, amongst a number of professional services firms we worked with recently, looks at the percentage of applicants who are successful at securing a graduate job. And of course, candidates will feature in more than one of these percentages. So for example, if you're an Oxbridge applicant, about 9.5% of applicants get offered a role and take it. Compared to, for example, if you've someone who's identified as having Black heritage, you're just over 2% likely to be successful. And in this data set, and these are not value judgments, it's in the data, we find interesting relationships. So for example, that population of applicants who identify as being from Black heritage are much more likely to come from lower income backgrounds. They're much, much less likely to have attended Oxbridge. And so here in the data, I think as Phil was describing, we can start to understand what are the variables that have the most significant effect. And here I think is a killer point that only the data could tell us. So we know in the data, most of the data that we've handled, and this echoes work, for example, from Sam Friedman and colleagues at LSE, that socioeconomic background has a stronger effect on outcomes, whether it's successful application, progression, pay, bonus. Socioeconomic background has a stronger effect on all of those outcomes than gender and race combined. And this is a really important finding for organizations that really want to take diversifying their workforce seriously. And there's a model of analysis called regression, which I won't go into here, which enables us to understand the relative effect of these variables on those outcomes. And those things are really important. And then final couple of slides. We do a lot of work on sort of success ratios. So this is telling us, this is a list of accountancy firms, and Access Accountancy have published these data, showing us what the likelihood of being successful if you're from an independent school is compared to being at a state school. So for example, it's showing us that at firm F, if you're from an independent school, you're 34% more likely to be successful compared to if you're from a state school. And I bring this data up this afternoon because the fascinating thing is here, why such huge differences? At firm H, for example, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are 31% more likely to be successful than those from independent schools. Whereas at firm G, the opposite is true. And we're interested, of course, using the qualitative data and looking at the approaches firms are taking about why these differences should be, given that there isn't a huge amount of difference between the firms in many other respects. And then finally, the who progresses question. So here we have looked at intersectionalities of different characteristics. So here you're looking at the number of years it takes, on average, employees from these backgrounds to get at this particular firm from grade E, which is sort of graduate entry grade, up to A, which is associate director. And we start to see what we've called, and others have called, of course, the progression gap. These progression gaps start to open up. You might notice there are some things missing from this graph here, not least those of Black heritage. The numbers, I have to say, were so small in that respect, we couldn't include them here, both an analytical challenge and indicative of the size of the problem. And then as we published in the financial sector last week, some of you may have seen, again, we see this same progression gap, even when we're controlling, i.e. taking account of different occupational areas and other aspects like gender and race. We see this progression gap of about 25% in the research we undertook in the financial services sector. So of course, this should concern firms and particularly bust the myth that actually everyone gets ahead equally, everyone has an equal chance. And the qualitative data helps us understand why that might be. So my final minutes here, what does good look like? And I'm only going to talk through this quickly because I'm sure it's come up in the previous discussions. This consistency of data collection is absolutely vital, which is why the publication last week from the Social Mobility Commission is so invaluable. The capability to map data sets, so to connect information about employees' socioeconomic backgrounds with their occupational area, progression, etc. We often find that's not a cultural issue. People are not resistant to it. It's often an IT issue. That often tends to be the biggest barrier there. And then this principle, and some of the firms exemplify this, of transparency and collaboration, sharing data. The more that we're transparent about the data and share it, the more likely we are to be creating the change that we want to. And then James, just to pick up on your comment, and this is my final slide, I think to get response rates higher, and of course, the rigor of the data depends on this. It's really critical, as with any D&I data, to say what it will not be used for. You know, we will not use this data to make individual decisions about people's pay, progression, or appointing them. James, you articulated it in a way that is much more compelling than the way I will. It has to be strategically connected and relevant. If you go out to your workforce out of the blue and ask them what their parents did when they were age 14, you're unlikely to get a huge response. If it's connected to your purpose and it's something as at Compass that you've been talking about for many, many years, people are much more likely to respond. What will you do with the data? What will it change? And then finally, I think it should be a continuous process. It's not something that's a sort of snapshot. It needs to be continuous, and you can mandate it. So the best example of this back in the day, about 10 years ago, was probably Grant Thornton. Colleagues couldn't fill in their bonus forms without declaring this type of data. Of course, they could say, I prefer not to say, or I don't know, but they had to go through the process of considering it. And I leave you with this final slide, which just speaks to Laura's point and my opening point about, you know, the numbers are only good if they're accompanied with a really strong understanding from the qualitative data as well. Gosh, what a whirlwind. Nina, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. I was giggling at your slide. Apologies.
Oh, sorry. Perhaps I took it down too quickly. I'll keep it up as we're talking.
No, that's all right. And actually, being a scientist at heart, I absolutely loved seeing your graphs and getting into the detail. I could really mine some of that. But actually, on that note, equally, I'm mindful that data, depending whether you love or hate it, it's a bit like Marmite. You can get into the detail and you can get into the weeds. So I guess for people who are on the phone who maybe again are starting out on this, obviously we've got some key questions that we'd like them to be asked. But when they start to get that data back in, is there any clear things that you'd say, actually, that's the area to look at first off? I know you mentioned things like attraction and progression, but are there just, you know, some great nuggets that you'd say, actually start here and then go from there?
Yeah, I think where this data is at its most simple is around recruitment, around, you know, what does the applicant pool look like compared to the pool in which we're kind of fishing, and is it representative at least of that? Who's more or less likely to be successful, and who accepts our offers? I think those are questions any you know, employer should be asking, frankly, not just by socioeconomic background, but more generally as well. I think the mapping and the data analysis typically involved in looking at something like progression is naturally a sort of slightly more complicated. But I have to say, you know, lots of firms we work with, even small firms, have people who are talented data analysts who often enjoy getting their teeth into this kind of thing. So I think start with the recruitment piece would be my advice, and keep it simple. You know, I think you need to take the whole organization on a journey, getting used to sharing and understanding and acting on this type of data. It's easy to overcomplicate, I would say.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Lindsay, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Nina, and thank you so much, Nick. We've had compliments pouring in from folks, and I think I was really struck by two things. One is the power of what you can do with this sort of data set. So for our participants to know that you ask those simple questions and then you can get such a range of rich data in your HR system. So hopefully you've seen across the speakers and presenters today what you can do quite easily on your own and what you can drive forward change. And you can see what added value, what benefit you can get from doing that extra deep dive with the help of a partner like Nick or others in the space. I was also struck, Nick, by a lot of the work in there. Implicit in it was a collaboration across sectors and the power that that collaboration has when you brought together the entire finance community, the accountancy community. You called out those sectors. I know it's also happened in law. It's just such a powerful thing, and is a great segue for me to completely self-promote here and let folks know that next week we at the Social Mobility Commission, with Nick at the Bridge Group and other partners who have worked with us and endorsed this work, are launching our first industry-specific toolkit. The first one is for the financial and professional services sector. If you are not signed up to that launch event, please do. We'll make sure to incorporate that in your post pack, a link to that. We are also going to be launching next year a few other sector-specific toolkits, including for retail, the public sector, and the creative sector. So hopefully, if you're not already plugged into that work, you're also welcome. The final thing I'd say is we've had a lot of conversation today about progression and the importance of progression and how to address it, and this question of, okay, well, once we've then wrapped up the data, then so what's the qualitative bit? And I want to, again, just signpost to folks, we at the Commission are working with our Commissioner, Sam Friedman, to do a quite comprehensive study on progression within the public sector, which we hope to be published in the new year. So keep an eye out for that too. We'll have some webinars, some sessions so you can learn, gain insights from that work as well. I want to thank you everybody so much for coming. I know we're a few minutes over time. We will send you the pack, the corrected pack. We'll send you a recording. We appreciate your time here, and we hope that you find the data pack useful. And the final thing just to say is, if you have feedback for us, please let us know. We're always really keen to improve. The whole data pack came about because people told us what was working and what wasn't. So we do want to respond to your needs, so do keep in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.